All right, we'll go ahead and get started. We're on Lesson 10, which is Daniel 5, so we'll wrap up Daniel 5 tonight. So Daniel chapter 5. Before we begin, we're going to start with a word of prayer. And Jordan's going to lead us in that prayer as we start.
All right, let's pray. Dearly Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for this opportunity to come together as brothers and sisters to study your word. Please be with us and let us take some words from Daniel to apply into our lives, to allow us to always fulfill all the things that we need to do as Christians so we can always spread your light to those who are searching. Lord, please with all those who are struggling in health and sickness, ask that you please put your healing hands upon them. Ask that you please be with us as we study now to be the teacher that presents to us things that please in your eyes, and ask that we again take this into the Lord for those who are searching, ask that we keep upon this will. Thank you for all that you've done. Thank you for your son and his name.
Amen. Thanks, Jordan. All right. I may have to pull out my better adapter here. This keeps changing on me. I didn't point out some of the artwork. Like I mentioned before, I love classic artwork. This is actually, I don't know how well you can see it with the lights on, but this is from Belshazzar's Feast. It's John Wolfgang Baumgartner. I had several different pieces of art in the last class I forgot to point out, but I think they're neat when you look at people's interpretations of what's happened in the Bible. Kind of helps to, at least helps me to kind of visualize things in some way the way other people visualized it. So we're in Daniel chapter 5, and we talked on Sunday night about Belshazzar, who he was. So we spent most of our time talking about that and some of the historical proof of who he was and his place as acting as king under his father Nabonidus, who was actually the king at that point in time, but had kind of abandoned his role and left Belshazzar in charge. We talked about what he did as far as bringing in the temple vessels and drinking wine from them, praising the gods, and then the handwriting on the wall. I didn't point out, I think we probably all know this, but we have a common phrase in our society: I can read the handwriting on the wall, or I can read the writing on the wall. That's actually where it comes from, is from this chapter. And then we talked about the queen and who she probably was. Certainly not one of his wives, but either the queen mother or his Nabonidus, his father's wife, perhaps even Nebuchadnezzar's widow, who Nabonidus had probably married to legitimize the throne. But the way that she talked to him, that's kind of where we left it. So we're going to jump in at this point, talking about him bringing Daniel before him and Daniel's response. So let's look at question 1 on your sheet. That points out that Daniel had accepted the role of authority that Nebuchadnezzar had bestowed upon him back in chapter 2, and Daniel interpreted the dream there with the statue that represented the 4 different kingdoms. So Daniel had accepted that, and for years had been in a position of leadership in the country. Why do you suppose Daniel replied to Belshazzar the way he did in 5:17? So when he's called around or called into him, and Belshazzar makes the offer to him, Daniel answered and said before the king in verse 17, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation." So why would he respond that way when he didn't respond at all that way to Nebuchadnezzar, and he accepted all of those gifts in that position? Okay. So that's possible, but maybe playing devil's advocate, if I remember correctly, back in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar kind of done the same thing. Whoever interprets a dream, I'll give these things. If you don't, I'm going to kill all the wise men. But that, it was kind of similar there that he'd offered things up front, and so in one sense, Daniel's doing that. So he wasn't accepting a gift as payment for what God told him to do. That's a possibility. Ryan? Good thoughts, Jenny?
Also, I don't know if Daniel knew what Belshazzar had just done at the feast too. It was very disrespectful to God and told things too. So Belshazzar is a very different person than Nebuchadnezzar. And I think Daniel was responding to the kind of person Belshazzar and to the heart to God.
Yeah, and I think Daniel did know, because when he talks to him at the end of this interpretation, he basically says what he had done, that you had disrespected him by bringing out the items, so he did know about it. Yeah, so I think all those. I see another hand, Jonah.
Also, correct me if I'm wrong, but the offer sent to be the third ruler in the kingdom, or the kingdom God is taken. So that's not.
It's kind of a meaningless position for what. Yeah, just from a practicality standpoint, it's worthless. Yeah, because it's not. It's like about is like right around the corner, right? Yeah, Dave.
Well, he didn't say no, stop, and walk away. He really went on to talk to him about that.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to him about how God was behind all these benefits that he had.
Mm-hmm.
Quite a thing.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of those things are probably all wrapped into it. We don't really know why he responded this way, but if you think back with Nebuchadnezzar, I mean, he was a brutal ruler at that point in time, right back in chapter 2. He was a powerful man. He did what he wanted to do, but also we've seen a progression in him. So there was a different character there, right? As we went through chapter 2 and 3 and 4, you saw a progression in him acknowledging who God was and recognizing him. Belshazzar's the other end of the spectrum, and I think we've seen the queen's response, and I think, as a couple of you said, he's a different person, and he's responding in a different way. And I mentioned last week that even in their culture, you wouldn't take the items from another god and disrespect them, because it might bring the wrath of that god on you. So he's showing utter disrespect for the God of heaven, and so that would seem to me to be part of the reason Daniel responds the way he does. He doesn't really want to work under this guy. Nebuchadnezzar, maybe a different story. Daniel was also a lot younger then. At this point in his life, maybe he doesn't really want to work anymore. But at any rate, he responds very differently than he did to Nebuchadnezzar at that point in time. Do you think Daniel was disrespecting the king's position, though? He still refers to him, O king. He shows the due respect that he would need to in that position. So he's not being disrespectful, but he's also not accepting the honor or the privilege, or feels any honor because being rewarded that way. How old is Daniel at this point? Well, we don't know how old he was when he went to Babylon, but got a rough idea? Yeah, if he was 15 when he was taken, then he would be around 80 at the time the Lion's Den, or a little bit older. So yeah, I calculated if he was 12 when he was taken captive, and we don't know, it's probably in that 12 to 15 range is what I think, but we don't really know. But if he had been 12, he would be 78 right now. So he's an old man no matter what. Sorry for those of you who are over 78. I consider myself an old man, and I'm well under that. But he's old. He's towards the end of his life. So he's not the young man from a few chapters ago, and I think sometimes we forget that because we've covered just a few chapters, but we've really gone from the beginning of his working life to past the end of his working life. So he's an older man at this point. He's lived a long time, and with the position he's been in, he's seen a whole lot. If you think about being second in command to Nebuchadnezzar, just a fantastic king from a world standpoint. So he's seen a lot. He's been a dignitary. Now he's under the rule of a foolish king. And so you've got to also kind of, I think, assume he recognizes this as a foolish king. He's worked with a lot of the role he's been in, he would have worked with a lot of other dignitaries from other countries, leaders from different parts of their empire, and so he's going to recognize Nebuchadnezzar was a wise king from a world standpoint in leading the kingdom. This is a foolish king who's disrespecting Jehovah. And so that's probably part of why he responded that way too, because he's had enough experience, age, he's got enough wisdom to understand that. And we were told early on that he was given an extreme amount of wisdom by God, so even as a young man he was wise, and you add to that the experience he's had, and he's going to recognize those differences. So asking question 2, I pointed out the length of his response to Belshazzar. We're not going to read it all, but he starts in verse 17, and he talks to him all the way to verse 28. But only verses 25 to 28 is he actually answering the king's question. What was the king's question? What's this mean? Yeah. What's it say? What's it mean? So that's the question. Daniel spends a whole lot of time talking about something else, and then he just very briefly answers the question at the end of that. So my question to you was, in question 2, what is he doing with the rest of his comments to the king, verses 17 through 24? Yes, Brianna? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he's highlighting Belshazzar's arrogance. He's pointing out that he should have known better because he knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He points that out to him. What else does he point out to him about that? I think Dave kind of mentioned this. Where was this lesson coming from, the lesson of Nebuchadnezzar? Where did it come from? From God, yeah. He points out to him that lesson came from God, and you've ignored that. Belshazzar should have known better. So in one sense, this is not unlike what he did with Nebuchadnezzar in his interactions, right? Remember each interaction he had with Nebuchadnezzar, what did he do? What did he point out to him? It was God's power. He pointed out to him this message is from God. Chapter 2, he gave God the credit for interpreting the dream, right? He started out by saying, no man can interpret it, this comes from God. In chapter 4, with the tree that was cut down, he actually talked to him and said, repent, change the way you are, and maybe these things won't happen to you. So he gave him godly advice and godly guidance, and he pointed him back to God. And that's really what he's doing here with Belshazzar. Belshazzar is a different person, but he's still pointing him back to God and saying, you should have known better than all this. So just as a side point, we'll step out of this lesson for a minute and think back to chapter 4 with Belshazzar's humbling, with Nebuchadnezzar's humbling with the dream that he had about the great tree. How does Daniel describe Nebuchadnezzar's position here when he's talking to Belshazzar? That's in verses 18 and 19. How does he describe Belshazzar's position? God gave it to him. He talks about the majesty that God gave him, that all peoples, nations, languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. Whomever he wished, he put down. So he's really elevating Nebuchadnezzar's position greatly here with the way he words it. But then how does he describe the illness, the mental illness that Nebuchadnezzar had? Verses 20 and 21. And I guess part of my question is does that shed any light for us on Nebuchadnezzar's situation? Because it's a little bit maybe vague what was going on with him in chapter 4. Do we see a little bit more here that gives us a little more insight into it? Yeah, he was totally debased like an animal. We kind of knew that in chapter 4, but it says he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts. So that's talking about his thinking, his thought process. He's like a beast. And it says they fed him with grass like oxen. And I don't know who the they is, but it kind of seems to me that he's saying the people of Babylon were actually feeding him like an animal, just like he was out in the field with the cows and the pigs and everything else, and they're feeding him. So maybe that's talking about the angels feeding him there, but I think it's more likely just the way it's worded that he goes from being the king and leader of everybody to being dependent on all of them, just like an animal would be. So it kind of shows the extremes that he was in. And it says his heart was made like the beasts in that sense and couldn't even provide for himself, just like an animal. So anyway, that's kind of the background that Daniel gives to Belshazzar. You should have known better. You knew about Nebuchadnezzar, and that was a message from God, and you've ignored it, Carl. Yes. And Nebuchadnezzar didn't he? Because we saw what happened with the proclamation he made that was very strong at the end of that. But Belshazzar, yeah, he does not. In fact, he should have recognized that from what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. So there's a strong point for us in that hopefully we'll talk about when we get to the applications at the end of this lesson. So a lesson not learned. So question 3, we've already kind of answered this. What was the reason given in verses 18 to 22 that Belshazzar should have known better? Carl? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Daniel pointed that out to him at the beginning of his talk. Yeah, because they weren't able to do anything about it. Yeah, But Daniel specifically points out, you knew about Nebuchadnezzar. You should have paid attention to that. You should have known better. So that tells us that what happened to Nebuchadnezzar was known. It wasn't just an issue between God and Nebuchadnezzar. It was a public thing, because even Belshazzar should have known about that. He'd been brought to the other end of the human spectrum. Daniel says, despite knowing this, you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. So it was something that he actually knew the facts. It wasn't something that Daniel's saying you should have known about. He says you knew it, and yet you didn't do that. So it's not stated here, but what had Nebuchadnezzar done 26 years prior to this in his response to his humbling? He made a new law, yeah. And he made a proclamation about how great God was, right? That was an official proclamation, so Belshazzar would have also known about that, and he's also ignored that. That was put in writing in Daniel chapter 4, so it was likely put in writing and publicly announced at that point in time. It'd be hard to think it wasn't when Nebuchadnezzar said what he did, and it was recorded in chapter 4. So that was very likely a public proclamation, just like the ones he'd made in chapter 2 and in chapter 3 and chapter 4. All right. So let's look at question 4. I ask you, what are the reasons given in verses 22 and 23 that Belshazzar and Babylon were about to be finished? I put down 4 different things that I saw there. You may have broken it down differently with less or more, but what reasons did you put down that they were about to be finished? I'll just put it that way for shorthand and praise the gods instead of God. What else did you see there? Yeah, so the temple vessels. So, and the way Daniel words that is he said he lifted himself up against God, right? And then Daniel points that out. He says, you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drunk from them. So he's using that as to show him how he had lifted himself up against the God of heaven. What else? Yes. His lack of humility or pride. He had not humbled his own heart. What else? Yeah. Didn't glorify the true God. And he says, who holds your very breath in his hand and owns all your ways. And he should have known to praise him, Jim. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting that it's not just because of what he did against God, it's because he didn't glorify God as he should have too. That's one of the reasons given. So he should have glorified God, and instead he did all these things that he shouldn't have done. And so those are the reasons. Did anybody have any other ones? You pick anything else out of there? Those are the 4 that I had down. Drew? Yeah. Yes. So it's not like there was an excuse for any one of them. You should have known better than any of these. Yep. So kind of keep that in mind as we talk about some of our applications for us later on. All right, we'll talk about the meaning of this interpretation and the outcome. Did the people in the room know what words were written on the wall? They certainly didn't know the meaning, right? It appears that they probably didn't know the words either, because it says in verse 8 that even the king's wise men couldn't read the writing, let alone interpret it. Why do you think they couldn't read it? We don't really know. It seems like it was written in a language they would understand when Daniel interprets it. It seems to be in Aramaic. But it's possible it was another language, and then Daniel interprets it into Aramaic, so that's one possibility. But it was probably the cryptic nature of it, as we talked a little bit about on Sunday, that even if it was written in their own alphabet, they couldn't really interpret the words to turn them into words because it was very cryptic if there wasn't the proper context or proper structure for it. from what I've read, they used consonants only and not vowels, and so you would have to have a context of everything to actually know what the word was. You couldn't just, I mean, if you think of it, if you take 4 words of our language and take the vowels out and throw together different words with no context in a sentence, it would be hard to actually know exactly what those words were supposed to be, and even more so in their language structure. So if you had just the consonants and no context, no other words around it, words that actually weren't part of a row, it would be hard to actually interpret it. But at any rate, they couldn't read it. They couldn't interpret what it meant. So what were the words that Daniel says were written there? Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. If that's pronounced right, probably not. I'm from Indiana, so I mispronounce a lot of words. So question 5. How might that cryptic message on the wall from verse 25, mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, because of what Daniel says about it, this is really kind of based more on the interpretation. How do you think that might have been written if it was worded in English with those 4 words? There's not a right or wrong answer here. I'm just asking you to kind of, I wanted to try to make it real for us and think about it. Carl?
Here's what I wrote. Since you have not made it up to God's standard, remove it and give it.
Okay. And I was actually trying to put it into those 4 words, like repeating the mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, what our words might be. But that's a good English interpretation of the meaning of all that for sure. Yeah, so that might be one way to put it. There's lots of different ways because he puts a lot of meaning into each one of these words in each of these phrases. Anybody have anything else there? This was just kind of a fun exercise to make us think about it more from our perspective. I think it's easy sometimes to look at a Bible story and think of some faraway exotic land and it's just not real, but it was their life. It was where they were, and so it'd be, for us, we'd be seeing all this in some form of English. So as Guthrie pointed out, numbered, weighed, divided. It could be numbered, lacking, divided. But what I wanted to kind of think about is even if you could read the words, you wouldn't know what it meant, right? If you just saw those words written on a wall, you'd think, well, even if you could read the words, what's that mean? So how would you explain the meaning, question 6, how would you explain the meaning of the writing on the wall? Carr gave us a good explanation there. Okay, he expects people to meet the standard, and so he's judging them, right, as a result, because they didn't. What other thoughts did you have? God's replacing you as king because you're arrogant, yeah. Yeah, that's kind of direct and to the point. God's replacing you as king because you're arrogant. Other thoughts? Drew? Yeah. Yeah, he's making a really strong point about that. And if you think of the whole picture of what's happened here, Belshazzar has taken the temple items, drunk wine from them, passed them out to everybody, and told them that he wants them to drink wine from it. Suddenly, a hand from God appears on the wall and writes these words, and the message is, I'm replacing you as king. So it flips that all around, right? He started out by saying, I'm above the God that we've conquered, and God flips it back around and says, no, you're not, I'm above you. So it's a very quick flip in the whole storyline, Ryan.
I think it also kind of, when we talk about Daniel told him because it shows there was a chance there for him not losing himself. It shows his accountability to the life and action. So this is not happenstance. This is not because God is going to give because he wants to do this. This is that Phil has our lazy choices and present choices we feel based on.
Yeah. And there's a measuring up that's done here. So kind of going along with that, it's interesting that the root words of mene, mene, tekel, upharsin are actually the names of weights. So the mene is the same as a mina or mina. We see that in the New Testament with the coins that were put in. And then tekel is, the root word of that is shekel. And then the last one is half shekel. So it's mina, shekel, half shekel are the root words of those words that are used there. And mene is Aramaic for a mina, which is 50 or 60 shekels. So you've got a larger volume there, 50 or 60 shekels. And it's from the verb to number. So again, that's part of why it might be hard for them to actually read it, and it doesn't actually look like any specific word because it's part of a root word and doesn't have all of the letters that we would put in it because we use vowels and consonants. But it would imply a weight, but also mean to number. And then it's repeated. What happens when we repeat something? What's the reason for that? Emphasis. It puts emphasis on it. That you've been numbered. You've been compared against this. You've been numbered. You've been numbered. It's a noun the way it's written, but the interpretation is given in a verb meaning. God has numbered the kingdom, and it's finished. So that's kind of the meaning that Daniel gives to it, but it's a simple word that just is a mina, or a numbering. And then tekel is also a unit of weight, and that means to balance or to weigh, just like we would think of with the scales, that you're balancing out or weighing it. Again, it's a noun the way it's written. It's interpreted as a verb, as in you have been weighed. So it's not just to weigh something, but it's you've been weighed. And it's implied, well, when you're weighing something, what's the implication there when somebody's going to weigh something? You're going to check it against a standard. So there's an expectation of how it's going to meet to a standard, right? So there's something, you're measuring it up to something. And so what he's saying is, you don't measure up. You've been weighed against it. You didn't measure up. You didn't measure up to God's expectation. And then Upharsin is what's given in the reading when he says the words, but then when he interprets it, he switches it to the word Perez, which is actually from the same root word. But again, it's a noun as written, interpreted as a verb. And I don't understand all of that from the Aramaic at all. I struggle with that even in English because my grammar was so many years ago. But that's what the commentaries all talk about. But the interesting thing here with this one is it implies half shekels. So it's like taking a shekel and breaking it in two, is the way the word's written. The U on Upharsin is kind of like our and, so it's like shekel and shekel is kind of what he's saying. So he uses shekel in the middle, you've been numbered, but then he says broken shekel, broken into two pieces. And what Daniel interprets it as is your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And so that's kind of, I just thought that wording was a little bit interesting, and it gives us a little more depth of understanding of the interpretation that's given there. There's a real poetic beauty to what God's doing and how he's giving this message to him. So Daniel interprets this. Mene, mene, tekel, Upharsin, tells him what it means. You've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdoms have been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Well, at first God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. And then what happens for Daniel in verse 29, which I think is interesting after the interpretation he just gave to Belshazzar. He gets the reward. Even though Daniel said, you keep the reward, he interprets it, and it's a very negative interpretation, and then he gets the reward. I just thought that was interesting. So, Babylon has been a magnificent kingdom. We talked a little bit at the beginning of chapter 4 about all the grand things that Nebuchadnezzar put together, how phenomenal his capital city was, all the wealth he brought in. He was a brilliant military strategist, just a phenomenal kingdom. And I'm looking at question 7 now. Nebuchadnezzar had been referred to as the head of gold. There's all these other kingdoms coming up through Rome, and Nebuchadnezzar is called the head of gold. And you've got you've got the Medes and Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, so all these fantastic empires. And he said Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon is the head of gold. So that's the kind of kingdom that we're talking about. So what seems odd to you about the way Daniel ends his account of the Babylonian Empire in verses 30 and 31? It's just, boom, yeah. It seems really odd because it's been such a great kingdom, and you've got this whole chapter about what's happening with Belshazzar, and you just get this, that night he died, and the kingdom, Darius the Mede was given the kingdom. Just really quick. Look at verses 30 and 31. That very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. That's the sum up of the transition. Just really quick, really brief. The glorious kingdom is stuffed out. So what does that tell us about who's really in charge of these kingdoms? It's God, yeah. It's God that's in charge. It's like if I just walked over to Dave and took the book out of his hand and handed it over to Jonah. It's just, this is not yours anymore, I'm giving it over here. And that's kind of what God does, and that's the end of the story. And it happened that night when this occurs. Just like a finger snap. All right, I'm going to have to switch to the Apple connector next time. And this is actually a Rembrandt. That's the picture that I've got on your sheet here. This is the Cyrus cylinder. I don't remember if I showed you this one before. I think I did early on, but we've seen the Nabonidus cylinder, the Nabonidus Chronicles, some other archaeological findings. This is the Cyrus cylinder, so it records Cyrus, who was the king of the Medo-Persian Empire at this point in time. So it's his recordings of the events that happened. And the Cyrus cylinder reports that Cyrus took Babylon without a fight. Just that he walked in and took it without a fight. That may be glorifying Cyrus's power. It would be common in their culture for a king to, kind of magnify what they did and not tell any of the negatives. But it says that he took it without a fight. It also says the Babylonian people welcomed him and rejoiced about his rule. So probably that's a little bit of exaggeration, but they didn't have big losses in taking this city, that's for sure. So I mentioned to you on the sheet what happened with Babylon. So I don't know if it's clear to you, but I'll kind of draw it out here. You've got the Euphrates that comes down into Babylon. And you've got the city of Babylon down here. And remember, it was a giant city, 17 miles square on each side, had double walls. The Euphrates flows through it. It's got this moat that goes all the way around it. So, and they've got supplies stored up for 20 years inside the city. So you can see why they would think, what's a siege going to do? We've got water, we got food, we got these walls you can't breach. They kind of laugh at them. But what the Medes and Persians had done, there was way back upstream, there was a lake up here, and they had dug a diverting canal over towards the Euphrates, and that night they actually opened up this channel right here and dammed this up. So all the water flowed over into the lake. That dries up this entryway, and then they can go in on the Euphrates bed underneath the wall. Does that make sense? So they went in, and because Herodotus and Xenophon recorded that not just in the temple or in the palace, but apparently throughout the city there was partying going on, and so that probably aided in them taking over because everybody was partying and not really paying attention to potentially being attacked. So it was an easy victory for the Medo-Persian Empire. So let's talk about some applications for us. Because again, I don't think it does us a lot of good to know the story of the Bible if we don't change the way we think and act and talk and everything else. So let's make some applications. That's question 8. And I pointed out to you there's a lot of applications we can make. So we don't have time with the 12 minutes we got left here or so to make all the applications we could. But let's talk about some of these. So first one I put down there was considering our pride versus honoring and praising God. So what are some applications that we can make from that? Always give glory to God. Jenny?
I was thinking too that because Daniel and even other like the council saying that he should have mentioned that pride, we need to be on guard because pride can really blind us.
Mm-hmm.
He would have known everything. He would have known Daniel in the second command. He would have known the things that had happened, but Belshazzar, that's like maybe he was so consumed with his own power, which is what happens when we're
Prideful.
we lack humility, when
Right.
we're prideful. We're kind of blinded to everything else around us that we could learn, and we kind of
I think it can be kind of hard to look at Belshazzar and think how we can learn from it because he totally ridiculed Jehovah, right? I mean, he got the temple vessels and drank from them and was basically ridiculing who he was when he'd seen all that. But we don't have to stoop to that level to still be prideful. Because we can be very prideful and not have that kind of an arrogance. So what are some other ways that we can be prideful? And tell me what you mean by that. Just full of pride. Yeah, and can we, so Belshazzar had, that's one of the points I wanted to make actually that I had down here. Belshazzar had taken the temple items and used them for his own purpose, right? He'd taken holy things of God and used them for his own purpose. Is it possible for us to use the things that God has set aside as holy, that he set aside for his purpose, and use them for our own purpose? What are some ways we can do that?
Well, I just think in our community, we can use even after service or teaching or the pulpit or wherever God puts us, even in his own church. And if we're doing it to bring attention to
Mhm.
ourselves or glory to ourselves so that people will compliment, you're so good at that. That's why we're constantly signing up to serve so that we get glory, then we have a
Exactly. And that's exactly one of the points I wanted to make. So I could be teaching, and if I'm doing it because I get glory for doing that, as opposed to I'm pointing other people towards God, or if somebody leads singing for that purpose, or preaches for that purpose, or leads as an elder for that purpose, or the women and the roles that you're doing and serving others, if you're doing it because other people see that you're serving, that's bringing the glory to ourselves, and we're using something that God has set aside for His purpose for our own benefit. So it's not exactly the same as what He was doing, but it's very similar in a lot of ways. And so we need to be on guard for that, because it's very easy to do. And as Jenny said, it's easy to miss that sometimes and look at that. Can we trust our own abilities and not totally lean on God? Because that's what He was doing, right? He was trusting His ability and His nation's strength and not totally leaning on God. Yeah, then we're taking credit for the things that God's done. Yep. Yeah. Yep, that's very true. I think another area where we can be like Belshazzar is showing national pride. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be proud of the country that we're in, but in our country, I think we often trust our government and our economy and our military power, and we put our trust and faith in that. And it's easy to trust in that and not just lean on God completely, so that even if our country fell and collapsed and our economy collapsed, that we would not change our faith and our belief in any way at all. And that's ultimately a form of pride. We don't realize God's in control. What about fighting and squabbling about politics? There's a lot of that goes on in our country. So if you step back for a second and think, okay, I don't know what anybody else's political views are, and I don't really care, but let's say Carl and I disagree completely, and we're always fighting about who should be in power and who should be controlling. What are we both really saying about our knowledge? Well, the God's not in control, and that's one thing, and we're also saying, I know what's best, right? So rather than saying God knows what's best, I'm saying, well, I know what's best. I know who ought to be in control. I know what the politics ought to be. And we don't. None of us know that. God's the only one that knows that. But ultimately, that's a form of pride also, when I think I know what's best for our country. I know what's best for this nation. That's kind of what they were doing. One other area that's very similar to Belshazzar, what Daniel pointed out to him, you should have known all this because of Nebuchadnezzar. So how can we apply that? That's an easy one for us. What should I be doing? Watching and learning, watching everybody around me, looking at other people's mistakes, looking at what they do right, and learning from what they do right. I shouldn't have to be the fool like Belshazzar that makes a terrible mistake when somebody else has already made that mistake, and I've seen the outcome of that. I've seen who they are and what they've done. So we see people all around us that make bad decisions and fail, and we ought to be learning from that. Because the same thing could be said to us. You should have known if it's something that's been in our environment. All right, let's look at the second part of that question, God's control of our government. What are some applications we can make from that? Let me ask you first, who decided that this night was the end of Babylon? God decided that. What does it tell us about God's power that He had already foretold this 60 years prior when He gave that vision of the statue image to Nebuchadnezzar? He knew what was going to happen already, right? So let me ask you this, is God in control of our government today? Absolutely. And we don't think that way sometimes. I think we think, Old Testament, God was very involved. He's kind of stepped back and just put things on autopilot now, and it all just kind of runs however it runs. He doesn't really care about it. That's not what we're told. What did Daniel say in chapter 5, verse 22, that repeats what was told to Nebuchadnezzar 3 times in chapter 4? And That's not 22, sorry. I gave you the wrong verse. 21, yeah. The Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses. Is that a statement that's relative just to their time? He's making just a statement about God, right? He rules in the kingdoms of men. So that's true for us today. So God is still in control of our government today. It's not a time-limited fact. So again, yeah, Carl. No, absolutely not. Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. You're exactly right. It does not mean it's a good government just because God is letting it exist. Jenny.
It also means that, we should kind of personally have a sense of peace about the ebb and flow of
Mm-hmm.
good government. But as Daniel operated in whatever government came along, I'm sure there were some scares and some fears and all that. I'm not saying it should be emotions, but we should have a sense that goes beyond
Yeah.
government.
Well, I mean, if you think about where Daniel started, he was living in his country in Israel, right? He's in Israel, God's people. He's ripped out of that. They attack the country, and short 15, 16, 17, maybe it's 19 years later, their whole nation gets totally destroyed. That's the background for Daniel, and now he's taken to another country with Nebuchadnezzar, who's a brutal king, doesn't know anything about Yahweh at that point in time. That's where Daniel lives. So he's not looking at thinking, oh, this is a great kingdom. This is a good government that God has picked and put in place. But yet he was taught to recognize that God rules in the kingdoms of men. So even in that kingdom, God was in control and using them. Yeah. And we see a storyline, if you think back to chapter 2, where God is using this whole process to lead us to the Roman Empire to bring the Savior to us. So it was all part of that plan. Very true. So I think from considering what we can learn from this chapter when we think about God's control of our government, as Jenny said, we don't need to be combative about politics. We don't need to be worried and concerned about it. We can still do our part as the abilities God's given us in this country and do our civic responsibilities. But beyond that, just leave it in God's hands and trusting in God rather than leaning on our nation and our economy for security. So I want to talk about that last one also, but we're out of time here. So we'll wrap up on Sunday by talking about speaking to others so they hear what they need from God and what we can learn from this just very briefly, and then we'll jump on into chapter 6. Thanks, everybody.